Hello there, and welcome back to Chronicle Keepers. Or if this is your first time joining us, welcome to a place where history meets the quiet hours of the night. Before we begin, take a moment to get comfortable. Dim your lights if you haven't already. Maybe turn on a fan, or settle into your favorite spot. There's no rush here, just stories waiting to unfold. Now, reach into your pocket or glance over at your wallet. Chances are there's a piece of paper in there, or at least there used to be, that represents hours of your work, your dreams, your morning coffee. We call it money. Paper money seems so obvious now, doesn't it? So universal. We barely think about it. But here's the thing. The idea of printing value onto paper was once considered absolutely revolutionary and honestly, quite controversial. People thought it was ridiculous, dangerous even. Just paper worth something? If you enjoy these late-night journeys through history, I'd genuinely appreciate a like or a subscribe, only if it feels right though. And I'm curious, drop a comment below and tell me, what currency do you use where you are? Do you even carry cash anymore? Or has everything gone digital for you? Right now, you're probably within arm's reach of paper money, or at least the digital concept of it. But where did this idea come from? Let's travel back to find out. Before we discover paper money, we need to understand why anyone would want to replace coins in the first place. After all, coins worked. Gold, silver, copper, bronze. These metals had been money for thousands of years. They were tangible, valuable, real. But they came with problems. So many problems. Let's put you in the shoes of a merchant. Maybe you're in Tang Dynasty China, around the year 800, or perhaps medieval Europe a few centuries later. You've just sold a large shipment of silk or spices or timber. Business is good. Now you need to collect your payment. Here come the coins. In China, the standard currency was copper coins with square holes in the center. Merchants would string them together on cords, 1,000 coins per string. Sounds manageable, right? But 1,000 copper coins weighs about 8 pounds. And 1,000 coins wasn't much money at all. For a truly large transaction, the kind that might fund a trading voyage or purchase a warehouse, you might need tens of thousands of coins, hundreds of thousands. Imagine it, carts full of nothing but money. Wheels groaning under the weight of copper, oxen straining to pull your payment down a muddy road. Now you might think, why not use gold or silver instead? Fewer coins, lighter load. And that's true. But gold and silver created a different problem. A single gold coin might represent a month's wages for a common laborer. Try buying bread with that. Try making change. The baker doesn't have enough copper in his entire shop to break your gold piece, so you're trapped. Copper is too heavy for large transactions. Gold and silver are too valuable for small ones. Every merchant, every trader, every tax collector, they all lived with this impossible balance. And the wait was just the beginning. Let's stay with you, the merchant. You've loaded your cart with coins. Now you need to get them home, or to your next city, or to the port where your ship waits. Do you know what a cart full of coins sounds like? It jingles, it clinks, it announces itself to everyone within 100 paces. Here I am, your cart seems to shout. Here I am, full of wealth, moving slowly down this road. Every bandit, every desperate farmer, every highway robber, they can hear you coming. They can hear exactly how much you're worth. And you can't hide it. You can't disguise it. Coins are heavy, they shift, they slide, they make noise. You might as well hang a sign around your neck that says, "Please rob me." The trade routes of the ancient world were dangerous places, not just because of bandits, but because the very nature of money made every merchant a target. You couldn't separate yourself from your wealth. Wherever your coins went, you had to go. And wherever you went, danger followed. So maybe you get home safely. You've made it back to your house with your earnings. Now you need to store them. Where? Where do you put thousands of pounds of copper? Or a small fortune in gold that represents your entire life's work? You need a vault, strong walls, iron locks, and even then, you lie awake at night, don't you? Listening for footsteps, wondering if the lock is strong enough, wondering if your neighbors have noticed how well your business is doing. Wealthy families in ancient Rome sometimes kept slaves whose only job was to guard the money room. Merchants in China built hidden compartments, false floors, secret chambers. Some buried their coins in the ground, only to forget where or die before they could retrieve them. Archaeologists still find these hoards today. Someone's life savings, hidden so well that even the owner never saw them again. This was the reality of physical money. It wasn't just a medium of exchange, it was a burden, a danger, a source of constant anxiety. The more successful you were, the more you had to fear. But let's say you're not worried about bandits. You live in a safe city. Your vault is strong. You have guards. You still can't escape the next problem. When someone hands you a coin, is it real? This might seem like a strange question. A coin is a coin. It's stamped with the king's face or the emperor's seal. It has a certain weight, a certain color. Surely you can tell if it's genuine, but you can't. Not easily, not without effort, because coins were clipped. This was a common practice, so common that governments passed law after law trying to stop it. You take a coin, you shave just a tiny bit of metal from the edge, so little that no one notices. Then you do it again to another coin, and another, and another. After 100 coins, 1,000 coins, you've collected enough shavings to melt down into a new coin. Free money. Except it wasn't free. It was stolen from everyone who later received those lightened coins. Some coins were sweated. You'd put them in a bag and shake them vigorously. The friction would wear off tiny particles of metal. Collect enough particles, make a new coin. Some coins were outright counterfeited. Base metals covered with a thin wash of silver, lead cores hidden inside gold shells, forgeries good enough to fool casual inspection. And so every transaction became a small investigation. Merchants kept scales, specialized weights, testing stones that could reveal the true metal content by the streak a coin left behind. They memorized the exact heft of legitimate currency from dozens of different mints. They examined edges for filing marks. They listened to the ring a coin made when dropped. You couldn't just buy something. You had to verify. You had to test. You had to doubt. And heaven help you if you traveled. Different cities minted different coins. Different kingdoms used different standards. A coin worth 10 in one province might be worth 8 in the next, or 12, or nothing at all, because that kingdom didn't recognize foreign currency. Money changers sat in every marketplace, taking their cut of every exchange. Exchange rates shifted daily based on rumors, on news from distant mines, on the whims of rulers who might decide to debase their currency overnight. Being a merchant meant being part mathematician, part metallurgist, part detective. Every transaction was a small negotiation, a small risk, a small leap of faith. Now let's think bigger. Not a single merchant, but an empire. How does an emperor pay his army? The Roman legions numbered in the hundreds of thousands at the empire's height. Each soldier expected payment in good silver coins, regular payment, on time. Do you have any idea how much silver that requires? How many wagons? How many guards to protect the wagons? How many administrators to count it, distribute it, record it? Paying a single legion could require tons of metal, moving across hundreds of miles through hostile territory on roads that turned to mud in the rain. Sometimes the money didn't arrive. Sometimes it was delayed or stolen or diverted by corrupt officials. And when soldiers don't get paid, well, history is full of the consequences. Mutinies, rebellions, emperors murdered by their own guards over late wages. Tax collection worked the same way, just in reverse. Instead of sending coins out, the government needed to bring them in. From every province, every city, every village. Carts and wagons and pack animals, all converging on the capital, carrying the weight of empire. The administration required to manage this flow was enormous. Armies of clerks counting coins, warehouses to store them, guards to protect them, officials to distribute them again for public works, for salaries, for the endless expenses of running a civilization. And international trade, even worse. And if you wanted to buy silk from China, or spices from India, or amber from the Baltic, you needed to physically transport payment across thousands of miles. Ships sank with their cargo of gold. Caravans vanished in the desert. The wealth of nations was constantly at risk, moving slowly across a dangerous world. Major construction projects, land purchases, loans between noble families. All of these required absurd amounts of physical metal. The time spent just counting large sums could take days. Trained counters working hour after hour, stacking coins, making marks, starting over when they lost count. And yet this was how the world worked for thousands of years, because no one had imagined it could be any different. There's one more problem we haven't talked about, perhaps the most fundamental of all. Where does metal money come from? From the ground. Only from the ground. If you want more gold coins, you need more gold. You need miners digging in the earth. You need veins of ore that haven't been exhausted. You need luck, really, because no one can create gold. No alchemist ever succeeded, despite centuries of trying. Gold is what it is. There's only so much of it. And the same is true for silver, for copper, for every metal that humans have used as money. This meant that the money supply was limited by geology, by chance, by the location of ancient mineral deposits laid down millions of years before humans existed. Sometimes a new mine would be discovered. Spanish conquistadors would find silver in the Americas, and suddenly Europe was flooded with new money. Prices would rise, economies would destabilize, and eventually things would settle into a new normal. But sometimes mines ran out. The easily accessible ore was exhausted. The shafts went deeper and deeper, becoming more dangerous, less productive, and slowly, gradually, the money supply would shrink. When there isn't enough money, trade suffers. Not because people don't want to buy and sell, but because they don't have the coins to do it. Goods pile up unsold. Workers go unpaid. The economy strangles itself, not for lack of resources or labor, but for lack of little metal discs to facilitate exchange. Minting coins was itself expensive. The metal had to be refined, measured, stamped. Skilled workers were needed. Equipment wore out. A percentage of every coin's value went to the cost of making it. And so civilizations were trapped. Their economies could only grow as fast as their mines could produce. Their prosperity depended on factors entirely outside human control: the location of metal deposits, the technology available for extraction, the luck of finding new sources before old ones dried up. By the time we reach medieval China, trade was expanding faster than anyone could have imagined. The Silk Road connected east and west. Maritime routes linked distant shores. Cities were growing. Populations were increasing. The economy wanted to explode with activity, but the metal couldn't keep up. There simply wasn't enough copper in the world to coin all the money that commerce demanded. There wasn't enough silver to lubricate the wheels of trade. The physical limitations of currency were becoming a genuine barrier to human progress. Empires were growing more complex. Governments needed faster ways to collect taxes, pay soldiers, fund projects. Merchants needed lighter ways to carry value. Traders needed something they could verify without scales and testing stones. The world needed a new idea. But this new idea would require something unprecedented. It would require people to trust something that had no inherent value. A piece of paper, some ink, a promise. That's it. Just a promise that this paper could be exchanged for something real. It sounds insane, doesn't it? It sounded insane to many people at the time. Paper burns, paper tears. Paper has no weight, no shine, no ancient history of value. And yet, someone was going to have to try. Someone, somewhere, was going to have to come up with a better idea. And surprisingly, that someone was in China. So we've established money's origin story, how humanity moved from barter to shells, to precious metals, to coins. The Greeks, Romans, Persians, Chinese, they all figured out that stamped metal discs could grease the wheels of commerce. But here's the thing about coins, especially the everyday kind. They're heavy. And that weight? It was about to inspire one of the most revolutionary and dangerous inventions in economic history. Let's travel to China, roughly 1,200 years ago, where someone looked at a pile of copper coins and thought, there has to be a better way. Picture yourself as a merchant in Tang Dynasty China. It's the 8th century CE. The Tang Dynasty is at its height, one of the golden ages of Chinese civilization. Poetry flourishes. The Silk Road hums with trade. Chang'an, the capital, is the largest city in the world. And your currency? Copper coins with square holes in the middle, strung together on cords. Now, copper coins are fine for buying vegetables at the market, but for serious commerce? Nightmare. The standard unit of account was a string of 1,000 coins. Do you know what 1,000 copper coins weigh? About 8 to 10 pounds per string. Imagine you're a silk merchant preparing to travel the Silk Road. You're buying goods worth, say, 100 strings of cash. That's 100,000 coins. That's roughly half a ton of copper. You'd need a caravan just for your money before you loaded a single bolt of silk. And it gets worse. Bandits love merchants carrying coins. The weight slows you down. The jingling announces your wealth. You're basically a slow-moving, noisy target. Oh, and copper was chronically in short supply. The government needed it for weapons, tools, and Buddhist statues. Sometimes there literally weren't enough coins to go around. Large-scale commerce was choking on its own currency. But China had something no other civilization had developed to the same degree: paper. And a bureaucracy sophisticated enough to make paper mean something. Around 800 CE, the Tang Dynasty government got creative. Here's the scenario. You're a tea merchant from the south. You've sold your tea in the capital, and now you're holding dozens of strings of heavy copper coins. You need to get home, a journey of hundreds of miles through potentially dangerous territory. The government says, "We have an idea. Deposit your coins at our Finance Commission office here in the capital. We'll give you an official paper certificate, stamped, signed, recorded in our ledgers. When you get home, take that certificate to your local government treasury. They'll give you your coins back." This was called feiqian, flying money or flying cash. Why flying? Because paper could travel in days what would take coins weeks. Money could effectively fly across the empire. Now, let's be clear about what this was and wasn't. Flying money was not currency. You couldn't walk into a shop and buy things with it. It was more like a government-operated wire transfer, a remittance system, a way to move value without moving metal. But it proved something profound. A piece of paper, backed by government authority, could represent money. The merchants trusted it because the Tang government was powerful and legitimate. The bureaucracy was sophisticated enough to maintain records across vast distances. And crucially, when you showed up at the other end, the coins were actually there. Flying money solved a logistics problem, but it planted a seed. What if paper didn't just represent money deposited somewhere? What if paper was the money? It would take another 2 centuries for someone to take that leap. And when they did, it happened in the most unlikely place, and for the most practical reasons. The Song dynasty rose to power in 960 CE, and the Song faced a peculiar problem in Sichuan province, in China's southwest. Sichuan was wealthy and commercially active, but it had virtually no copper. The region used iron coins instead, which were even heavier than copper. Some accounts suggest that buying a pound of salt required 1.5 pounds of iron coins. Commerce was grinding to a halt under the literal weight of money. So around 1023 CE, something remarkable emerged. Jiaozi, the world's first true government-issued paper currency, not deposit receipts, not transfer notes, actual money, printed on paper, that you could use to buy things directly. Let me describe what these notes looked like, because the Song didn't mess around. They were printed on special paper made from specific plant fibers, paper that was difficult to source and reproduce. The notes featured multiple colors of ink, intricate designs of buildings and landscapes, and official seals. They had serial numbers. Different denominations had different designs. And here's the key innovation. These weren't just pretty receipts. A jiaozi note was payment itself. A merchant could accept jiaozi for goods and use that same note to pay suppliers. The paper circulated, passed from hand to hand, functioning as money. Initially, jiaozi were backed by reserves, iron coins, copper coins, silver, silk. The government promised that you could, at least in theory, exchange your paper for real money. The notes even had expiration dates, typically around 3 years. When your jiaozi expired, you'd exchange it for newly issued notes. This let the government periodically reset the system and take a small fee in the process. What started in Sichuan spread. By the late Song dynasty, paper money circulated throughout much of the empire. China had invented something that wouldn't appear in Europe for another 600 years. Here's the question. Why China? Why did paper money emerge there and nowhere else? The answer involves a unique combination of factors that existed nowhere else in the world. First, paper-making technology. China had invented paper over 1,000 years earlier. By the Song dynasty, paper production was sophisticated and widespread. The raw material for money existed. Second, printing technology. China had invented woodblock printing. By the Song era, they could mass-produce documents with consistent quality. The ability to manufacture money existed. Third, a massive, literate bureaucracy. The Song government employed hundreds of thousands of officials who could read, write, keep records, and maintain ledgers across vast distances. The administrative capacity to manage paper money existed. Fourth, centralized authority with legitimacy. People accepted paper because they trusted, or at least feared, the government enough to believe the paper meant something. The social infrastructure for paper money existed. And fifth, brutal enforcement. Counterfeiting carried the death penalty, and the Song didn't just threaten it, they carried it out regularly. The notes themselves often printed warnings about the punishment for forgery. The teeth to protect paper money existed. No other civilization on Earth had all five of these elements simultaneously. The Byzantines had bureaucracy, but no paper. The Islamic caliphates had sophisticated commerce, but fragmented authority. Europe was still figuring out how to keep kings from being murdered by their relatives. China had cracked the code. Paper money worked. Until it didn't. Here's the problem with paper money, and it's a problem that China learned the hard way. A lesson that every society since has had to learn again. Paper money works when the government maintains discipline. When the amount of paper roughly corresponds to the economic activity it represents. When people trust that the money will hold its value. But paper is so easy to print, and governments always need money. The Song dynasty discovered something intoxicating. They could create money from nothing. War with northern invaders, print money to fund the army. Bureaucracy getting expensive, print money to pay salaries, tax collection falling short. Why bother collecting taxes when you can just print? The temptation was irresistible, and gradually the Song printed more and more jiaozi, far beyond their reserves, far beyond what the economy could absorb. The result? Prices rose. People started refusing to accept paper at face value. The currency depreciated. But it was the Mongol Yuan dynasty, which conquered China in 1271, that really went off the rails. The Mongols loved paper money. Why wouldn't they? They could fund their vast empire with paper instead of silver. Kublai Khan, yes, that Kublai Khan, issued paper currency that Marco Polo famously marveled at. But the yuan printed money like it was going out of style, which eventually it was. By the end of the Yuan dynasty, their paper currency had become virtually worthless. Hyperinflation devastated the economy. When the Ming dynasty took over in 1368, they initially tried paper money too, and they made the same mistakes. By the mid-1400s, the Ming had largely abandoned paper currency and returned to silver and copper coins. China, which had invented paper money, gave up on it because they had learned how easily it could destroy an economy. So what had China proven in this 400-year experiment? They proved that paper money could work, that people could accept government promises instead of precious metals, that the concept we now call fiat currency, money that's valuable because the government says it's valuable, was viable. But they also proved the danger, the seductive, destructive danger of creating money from nothing. Print a little to facilitate trade? Brilliant. Print a lot to avoid hard choices? Catastrophe. Paper money is a tool. Like fire, it can warm your house or burn it to the ground. The difference lies entirely in how you use it. Now here's what's fascinating about this history. While China was experimenting with paper money, learning hard lessons about inflation and eventually retreating back to metal coins, Europe had no idea any of this was happening. European merchants in the medieval period were still doing exactly what merchants had done for centuries, physically transporting bags of gold and silver coins across dangerous roads, losing money to bandits and shipwrecks, struggling with a chaos of different currencies in every city and kingdom. They needed a solution, but it wouldn't come from their kings or emperors. It would come from an unlikely place: families of Italian merchants who would figure out how to make money move without physically moving at all. In our next segment, we'll meet the medieval bankers who revolutionized European finance and accidentally created the template for banking that still shapes our world today. While China was experiencing its dramatic cycles of paper money success and failure, Europe was walking an entirely different path, a slower path, a messier one, but perhaps, in the end, a more sustainable approach to the same destination. Let's cross continents and explore how the Western world discovered paper money, not through imperial decree, but through the quiet innovations of bankers, goldsmiths, and merchants. As late as 1200 CE, when China had already been using paper money for over 2 centuries, Europeans knew nothing about it. The vast distances of the Silk Road carried silk and spices, porcelain and ideas, but somehow the concept of paper currency never made the journey. Marco Polo would eventually write about Chinese paper money in his famous travels, describing it with wonder and amazement. But his European readers treated it as just another exotic curiosity from a strange and distant land. Interesting, perhaps, but surely not practical for civilized European commerce. And honestly, even if Europeans had understood the concept fully, they probably wouldn't have trusted it. You see, China had something that medieval Europe completely lacked: a strong, centralized imperial authority. When the Song Emperor declared that paper was money, his word carried weight across a vast, unified realm. Millions of subjects, one government, one currency. Europe was not like that. Picture the European continent in the 13th century. Hundreds of kingdoms, duchies, city-states, and principalities, each with its own ruler, each with its own coins. A merchant traveling from Venice to London might pass through a dozen different territories, each demanding payment in different currency. There was no single emperor who could declare paper to be money. No unified authority whose promise would be trusted from the Mediterranean to the Baltic. Europe was fragmented, quarrelsome, and deeply suspicious of any authority beyond the local lord or city council. But Europe had its own problems with coins, the same problems China had faced: weight, security, authenticity. And European merchants, being clever and practical people, would develop their own solutions, different solutions, solutions that would eventually lead to paper money, but through an entirely unexpected route. If paper money was going to emerge in Europe, it would start in Italy. In the 13th and 14th centuries, the Italian peninsula was home to the most sophisticated commercial culture in the Western world. City-states like Florence, Venice, and Genoa had grown wealthy on trade. Their merchants traveled throughout the known world. Their ships dominated Mediterranean commerce, and their bankers were inventing the future. Consider the Medici family of Florence. Starting as wool traders, they built a banking empire that stretched across Europe. Medici banks operated in Rome, Venice, London, Bruges, and beyond. They financed popes and kings. They funded the Renaissance itself. But how did they move money across such vast distances? How did a Florentine merchant pay for goods in London without shipping a chest of gold coins across the Alps, through France, across the English Channel? The answer was a remarkable invention called the bill of exchange. Imagine you're a wool merchant in Florence. You need to pay a supplier in London 100 gold florins. The journey would take weeks. The dangers would be enormous. The cost of guards and transport would eat into your profits. Instead, you visit your local Medici bank. You deposit your 100 florins and receive a paper document, a bill of exchange. This bill is essentially a letter to the Medici Bank in London, instructing them to pay 100 florins, or the equivalent in English pounds, to whoever presents this document. You send the lightweight paper document to your supplier. Your supplier takes it to the London branch. They receive their payment. The actual gold never left Florence. Now here's where it gets interesting. That bill of exchange didn't have to go directly to your supplier. It could be endorsed, signed over to someone else. Your supplier might owe money to a third party. Instead of cashing the bill, they could sign it over as payment for their own debt. That third party could do the same. A single bill of exchange might change hands 5 or 6 times before anyone actually redeemed it for gold. Do you see what's happening here? The paper itself is circulating as if it were money. People are accepting it not because of what it is, but because of what it represents. A promise, a claim on real gold, held somewhere far away. This wasn't quite paper money, not in the sense that Chinese flying cash was money. Bills of exchange were specific documents for specific transactions. They weren't standardized. They weren't issued in convenient denominations. They were tools for merchants, not currency for common people. But the principle was revolutionary. Value could be represented on paper. Trust could travel lighter than gold. Now let's jump forward 2 centuries and cross the English Channel to London. The year is somewhere in the early 1600s. A new innovation is about to emerge, not from great banking families, but from humble craftsmen. Goldsmiths. London's goldsmiths worked with precious metals every day. They made jewelry, decorative objects, and fine tableware for the wealthy. And because they worked with gold, they needed secure storage, strong vaults, heavy locks, protection against theft. Wealthy Londoners noticed these vaults, and they had a problem. England had recently been through a civil war. The monarchy had been overthrown, restored, threatened again. In times of political chaos, where do you keep your life savings? At home, where soldiers or mobs might seize it. In the Royal Mint, where kings had been known to borrow deposits and never return them. The goldsmiths' vaults started to look very attractive. Merchants and wealthy individuals began depositing their gold and silver with goldsmiths for safekeeping. In return, they received paper receipts, simple documents recording that John Smith had deposited £50 of gold with Thomas the goldsmith, to be returned upon demand. Nothing revolutionary so far, just receipts, just record-keeping. But then something magical happened. Let's say John Smith needs to pay a debt to William Jones. Traditionally, he would go to the goldsmith, withdraw his gold, carry it across London, and hand it to William. Heavy, dangerous, inconvenient. But what if John just gave William the receipt instead? William could take that receipt to the goldsmith and claim the gold himself. Or William could hold on to the receipt and use it to pay his own debts later. As long as everyone trusted the goldsmith, the receipt was as good as gold. Better than gold, actually. Lighter, easier to hide, easier to divide by simply writing new receipts for partial amounts. The receipts began to circulate, passed from hand to hand, accepted in payment, because everyone knew they could be redeemed for real gold whenever they wished. The goldsmiths had accidentally invented a form of paper money, and then they made another discovery, a more dangerous discovery. The goldsmiths noticed something interesting about their depositors' behavior. People left their gold sitting in the vault for months, even years. They used the receipts for daily transactions. Only occasionally did anyone actually withdraw the physical metal, which meant the goldsmiths were sitting on piles of gold that no one was using. What if they lent some of it out, charged interest? As long as they kept enough gold to cover normal withdrawals, who would know? Who would be harmed? The goldsmiths began writing receipts for more gold than they actually held. They would lend money to borrowers, money that existed only as paper, backed by gold that belonged to someone else. As long as everyone didn't demand their gold at the same time, the system worked beautifully. This was the birth of fractional reserve banking, the foundation of modern finance, and also the source of a vulnerability that would cause countless crises in the centuries to come. Because what happens when trust fails? When rumors spread that a goldsmith has lent out too much? When everyone rushes to withdraw at once? The system collapses. There isn't enough gold for everyone. The receipts become worthless. This tension between the efficiency of paper money and the terror of bank runs would haunt Western finance for the next 400 years. The first official European banknotes emerged in an unlikely place. Not wealthy England or sophisticated Italy, but Sweden. In 1661, a banker named Johann Palmstruch founded the Stockholm Banco and began issuing paper notes that could be exchanged for copper coins. Sweden had a peculiar problem. Its copper coins were enormous and incredibly heavy, making paper alternatives especially attractive. For a few years, the system worked wonderfully. Merchants loved the lightweight notes. Trade flourished. Then Palmstruch got greedy, or perhaps just overconfident. He issued more notes than his bank could redeem. People began to doubt. Doubt led to panic. Panic led to a run on the bank. The Stockholm Banco collapsed in 1664, just 3 years after issuing its first notes. Johann Palmstruch was arrested, tried, and sentenced to death. The sentence was later commuted to imprisonment, but his banking career was thoroughly over. Yet the idea survived. Sweden learned from the disaster and created a more carefully regulated system. And across the North Sea, England was watching with interest. In 1694, the Bank of England was founded. Its original purpose was to lend money to the government for a war against France. But it quickly began issuing banknotes, paper promises to pay the bearer in gold or silver on demand. These notes were different from Chinese paper money in a crucial way. They weren't fiat currency, declared valuable by government decree. They were receipts. Claims on real metal held in real vaults, convertible, at least in theory, whenever the holder wished. The Bank of England notes were more stable than the Stockholm Bancos had been, more carefully managed, backed by a growing empire's wealth and credibility. They would circulate for centuries, gradually becoming trusted throughout the commercial world. But they were still, fundamentally, promises, and promises can be broken. Let's pause and consider how different this European path was from China's journey. In China, paper money was a government creation from the beginning. The emperor declared it valuable. The state enforced its acceptance. The entire system depended on centralized authority. In Europe, paper money emerged from private banking, from goldsmiths and merchants, from families like the Medici seeking practical solutions to practical problems. The state was often a customer of this system, not its creator. European notes were backed by gold and silver reserves, at least supposedly. You could walk into the Bank of England and demand metal for your paper. This convertibility was meant to provide confidence, a check on overissue, a guarantee that the paper represented something real. China's later experiments with fiat currency had no such backing. The paper was valuable because the government said so, nothing more. When confidence failed, there was nothing underneath to fall back on. The European system also meant that there was no unified currency. Each bank issued its own notes. Each note was only as trustworthy as the institution behind it. A Bank of England note might be accepted everywhere. A note from a small country bank might be refused the next town over. This fragmentation was inefficient, confusing, sometimes chaotic, but it also meant that no single authority could destroy the entire system. If one bank failed, others survived. If one government debased its currency, merchants could flee to alternatives. Europe stumbled into paper money through 1,000 small innovations. Trial and error, success and failure, private initiative responding to market needs. It was messier than China's approach, slower, but perhaps more resilient. But let's not romanticize European banking. The system had deep, persistent problems. Paper money requires trust. Trust that the issuer will honor their promise. Trust that the gold backing the notes actually exists. Trust that tomorrow, next year, next decade, your paper will still be worth something. In fragmented Europe, trust was hard to establish and easy to lose. Banks failed regularly. It wasn't a matter of if, but when. Economic downturns, bad loans, overissue of notes, rumors and panics. The history of European banking is littered with collapses that wiped out note holders overnight. When a bank failed, its notes became worthless paper. Families lost everything. Businesses collapsed. The economy contracted. And yet, somehow, people kept using paper money from other banks. The convenience was too great to abandon. Counterfeiting was another constant plague. Unlike coins, which required metal and minting equipment, paper notes could be forged with just ink and paper. The skills were common. The temptation was enormous. Governments responded with brutal penalties. In England, counterfeiting banknotes was high treason, punishable by hanging. The bodies of counterfeiters were sometimes displayed as warnings. It made little difference. The potential profits were simply too great. Banks fought back with increasingly complex designs, watermarks, special paper, intricate engravings that were difficult to reproduce. A constant arms race between forgers and note issuers that continues to this day. Even honest people remained skeptical. Paper felt wrong somehow, ephemeral, suspicious. Real money was supposed to be gold and silver. Real money had weight and substance. Paper was for letters and books, not for storing the value of your labor. This skepticism would persist for centuries, and in some ways, it was justified. Here's something important to understand about early European paper money. For most people, it didn't exist. Banknotes circulated among merchants, among wealthy landowners, among the commercial and financial elite. Large transactions between businesses might use paper. Government bonds and bills of exchange greased the wheels of international trade. But the common person, the farmer, the baker, the blacksmith, the servant, lived in a world of coins. They were paid in coins. They bought their bread in coins. They saved coins in jars and strong boxers. They might go their entire lives without touching a banknote. Paper money was for other people, richer people, people who dealt in sums that required paper. The daily economy remained metallic, tangible, familiar. This would change, but slowly, so slowly. The transition from coins to paper for ordinary transactions would take over 200 years in most European countries. Even in the 19th century, when banknotes were well established, many people preferred coins for their reliability and universality. It wasn't until governments began issuing standardized national currencies, guaranteed by the state, that paper money truly became universal. And that process wouldn't complete until the 20th century in many places. Think about how long that is. From the first goldsmith's receipts in the 1600s to paper money in everyone's pocket. 300 years, a dozen generations. Change so gradual that each generation barely noticed the shift. What did Europe contribute to the story of paper money? The private banking system, fractional reserves, central banks, the complex dance between government currency and private financial innovation. The idea that paper money should be backed by something real, convertible on demand. These concepts would spread around the world. They would shape how nations think about money even today. The debates we have about currency, about gold standards and fiat money, about central bank policy and financial regulation, all of them trace back to these European innovations. But Europe's journey was just one path up the mountain. The destination was the same as China's, paper representing value, trust replacing metal. But the route was entirely different. Private rather than public, gradual rather than sudden, backed rather than decreed. Neither system was perfect. Both had catastrophic failures. Both required centuries of experimentation to approach stability, and both would influence what happened next. Because across the Atlantic Ocean, a new nation was being born. A nation that would inherit European banking traditions but face uniquely American challenges. A nation that would experiment with paper money in ways both creative and catastrophic. Europe stumbled into paper money through banking innovation rather than government decree. But across the Atlantic, a revolutionary new nation would take this concept and run with it, sometimes literally running into disaster. So far, we've seen money evolve from shells to coins to paper, watched China pioneer paper currency and learn hard lessons about inflation, and seen Italian bankers invent sophisticated instruments to move money across Europe without moving metal. Now we're crossing the Atlantic to witness something remarkable. A brand new nation systematically making every single mistake in the monetary playbook, often simultaneously, sometimes repeatedly. American early paper money history is a comedy of errors. It's also a tragedy of lost savings, economic chaos, and political dysfunction that would shape the country's relationship with money for centuries. Let's watch the disaster unfold. Imagine you're a colonist in British America. It's the late 1600s. You're trying to build a life in this new world, but you have a problem. You have no money, literally. See, England viewed the colonies as a source of raw materials, timber, tobacco, furs. Wealth was supposed to flow from the colonies to England, not the other way around. So the Crown forbade the colonies from minting their own coins. And British coins? Most of those stayed in Britain. The colonies were starving for currency. How did people manage? They got creative. In Virginia, tobacco became money. You could pay your taxes in tobacco. You could buy goods with tobacco warehouse receipts, paper notes proving you had tobacco stored. An early commodity currency. Throughout the colonies, people used wampum, Native American shell beads. They used beaver pelts. They used Spanish silver dollars, pesos, which had somehow found their way north. They used anything that enough people agreed had value. But mostly, they bartered. And barter, as we discussed way back in segment 1, is inefficient. Economic growth was strangled. A farmer might have surplus crops, but no way to buy tools because the blacksmith didn't need corn. Trade between colonies was cumbersome. Commerce that required credit was nearly impossible. The colonies needed currency, and if England wouldn't provide it, they'd create their own. In 1690, Massachusetts Bay Colony made history. The colony had sent soldiers north to fight the French in Quebec. It was a disaster. The expedition failed, and now the soldiers were home demanding their pay. Problem: the colony had no money. Solution: create some. Massachusetts issued bills of credit, paper certificates promising to pay the bearer in silver coins. Soldiers received these bills as payment. The government declared the bills would be accepted for taxes. The colony pledged to redeem them eventually. This was the first government paper money issued in what would become America. And at first, it worked. People accepted the bills because they knew the government would take them for taxes, giving the paper fundamental value. Soldiers could buy supplies. Merchants could do business. The economy moved. Other colonies noticed. By the early 1700s, South Carolina, New York, New Jersey, Rhode Island, one colony after another issued their own paper money. These bills were primitive by Chinese or even European standards, often hand-signed, simple woodcut designs, printed on whatever paper was available. They looked almost invitingly easy to forge, but for a while, they worked. Colonial paper money facilitated trade, enabled growth, and solved the coin shortage that had plagued commerce for decades. Benjamin Franklin became a passionate advocate. He wrote pamphlets defending paper currency. His printing business in Philadelphia printed money for Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Delaware. Franklin even developed anti-counterfeiting innovations, embedding actual leaves in the paper, creating patterns that were hard to reproduce. Colonial America, by accident and necessity, had reinvented paper money. But success brought its own problems. The simplicity that made colonial paper money possible also made it vulnerable. Counterfeiting became epidemic. The printing technology was basic. Some counterfeit notes were nearly indistinguishable from the real thing. Others were laughably crude, but in communities where many people couldn't read, even bad fakes could circulate. Colonies imposed savage penalties. Counterfeiting was typically punishable by death. Some colonies branded forgers with hot irons. Others cropped their ears. Pennsylvania prescribed the pillory, public whipping, and 31 years of hard labor. It didn't matter. The profits were too tempting. The risks of detection too low. And during the Revolutionary War, counterfeiting became weaponized. The British printed fake colonial currency to destabilize the economy. Counterfeit bills flooded the colonies, undermining trust in all paper money. Franklin fought back with increasingly sophisticated printing techniques, complex borders, unique typefaces, designs that were hard to copy. But it was a losing battle. Colonial paper money was never truly secure. And then the revolution came, and everything got much, much worse. In 1775, the Continental Congress faced a problem familiar to Massachusetts 85 years earlier. They needed to fight a war and had no money to pay for it. The solution was also familiar: print it. Congress authorized Continentals, paper currency, to finance the revolution. Now, there was an immediate problem. Unlike colonial bills, Continentals had no gold or silver backing, no reserves, no established tax system to create demand, just promises. The Continental Congress essentially said, "This paper is money because we say so. Trust us. Once we win independence, we'll make it good." Would you trust that promise? At first, people did. Patriotism ran high. The early Continentals circulated at close to face value. But Congress kept printing, and printing, and printing. Between 1775 and 1779, Congress issued over $200 million in Continentals. The states printed another $200 million of their own currency, and the British counterfeiting operation flooded the market with fakes. The predictable happened. By 1779, it took 40 continental dollars to buy what one had bought in 1775. By 1781, the exchange rate was over 100 to 1. People used continental currency as wallpaper. They carried wheelbarrows of bills to buy basic goods. The phrase "not worth a continental" entered the American vocabulary. It remains there today. People who had patriotically saved in continentals, who had sold goods to the army for paper promises, watched their life savings become worthless. Soldiers who'd fought for paper scrip found themselves unable to buy food for their families. The revolution very nearly collapsed under the weight of worthless currency. Only foreign loans, actual gold and silver from France and the Netherlands, kept the Continental Army in the field. America won its independence, but millions of Americans learned a brutal lesson about paper money backed by nothing but promises. That lesson would shape American politics for generations. After independence, things somehow got worse. The Articles of Confederation gave Congress almost no power. Each state could and did print its own currency. So now you had 13 different currencies, 14 if you counted the worthless continentals still floating around. Each state's money had different levels of trustworthiness. Massachusetts, with relatively sound finances, printed conservatively. Rhode Island printed aggressively and forced creditors to accept depreciated currency at face value, essentially using inflation to wipe out debts. If you were a merchant trying to do business across state lines, good luck. You needed to track exchange rates between state currencies. You never knew if the New York notes a customer offered were actually worth anything in Pennsylvania. Creditors were terrified. Debtors were gaming the system. Interstate commerce, exactly what a new nation needed to build, was strangled by monetary chaos. James Madison, watching this disaster unfold, would later call the state currency experiments a pestilent and mortal disease. Something had to change. The men who wrote the Constitution in 1787 had lived through the Continental disaster. They'd watched state currencies destroy trust and impede commerce. They were terrified of paper money. Article 1, Section 10 of the Constitution is blunt. No state shall coin money, emit bills of credit, make anything but gold and silver coin a tender in payment of debts. States could no longer print money, period. The federal government received the power to coin money, regulate the value thereof. Note the word coin, not print. Did the Constitution authorize the federal government to issue paper money? It didn't say. And that ambiguity whether Congress could constitutionally create paper currency, would haunt American politics for decades. The founders, burned by Continentals, had essentially designed a system that pushed America back toward hard money, gold and silver coins. But a growing economy needed more currency than gold and silver alone could provide. Enter the banks. Alexander Hamilton, the first Treasury Secretary, understood the problem. He proposed a solution: the first bank of the United States. The bank, chartered in 1791, would issue banknotes, paper currency backed by gold and silver reserves. Not government money exactly, but notes from a quasi-governmental institution. It worked. First banknotes were trusted. They facilitated commerce. The early republic's economy grew, but many Americans, particularly followers of Thomas Jefferson, hated it. They saw the bank as an aristocratic institution benefiting wealthy financiers at the expense of common people. They questioned its constitutionality. They feared concentrated financial power. The first bank's charter expired in 1811 and wasn't renewed. A second Bank of the United States was created in 1816, issuing similar notes. And Andrew Jackson, war hero, populist president, loathed it with the fire of 1,000 suns. Jackson called the bank a hydra of corruption. He vetoed the renewal of its charter. In 1836, the second bank died. America had killed its closest thing to a central bank, and what followed was financial chaos that makes everything before look orderly. From 1837 to 1863, America descended into the free banking era. Here's how it worked, or rather, didn't work. Each state could charter banks. Each bank could issue its own paper currency. There was no federal oversight, no national standards, no coordination. The result? By the 1850s, an estimated 8,000 different bank currencies circulated in America. 8,000. Let me paint you a picture. You're a merchant in Philadelphia. A customer offers you a $10 note from a bank in rural Michigan. Is that note worth $10? Is it worth 5? Is it worth 0? You genuinely don't know. People carried banknote reporters, printed guides that listed thousands of bank currencies, their supposed values, and their reliability. These guides were updated regularly because banks failed constantly. Wildcat banks set up in remote locations, literally where the wildcats roamed, issued notes, then vanished. If you wanted to redeem your notes for gold, good luck finding the bank. Counterfeiting flourished. Some historians estimate that by 1860, between 1/3 and 1/2 of all paper currency in circulation was counterfeit. This was the most powerful economy in the Western Hemisphere, conducting commerce with a monetary system that was essentially designed for fraud and confusion. Why? Because America was so traumatized by continental hyperinflation, so ideologically opposed to concentrated financial power, that it accepted chaos rather than risk another government currency disaster. It would take the greatest crisis in American history to finally force a change. Look, American early money history is genuinely painful to study. It's one mistake after another. Continental hyperinflation, state currency chaos, the destruction of central banking, the free banking insanity. Other countries learned from their monetary disasters. America seemed determined to repeat every possible error, often while loudly insisting that this time was different. And the cost was real. Lost savings, failed businesses, economic growth, stunted by monetary dysfunction. Trust, the essential ingredient in any monetary system, systematically undermined. But here's what's important to understand. These disasters weren't random. They flowed from real fears, real experiences, real political beliefs. Americans who'd been burned by worthless continentals had legitimate reasons to distrust paper money. Farmers who'd watched banks foreclose on their land had legitimate reasons to hate financial institutions. The problem was that their solutions often created new disasters. It would take a civil war to finally force America to create a stable national paper currency. And even then, even after the chaos we've described, the debates weren't over. In our next segment, we'll see how the Civil War finally birthed the greenback, created national banks, and set America on a path toward the monetary system we know today, though that path would have plenty of its own disasters along the way. After the Continental disaster, America spent decades avoiding paper money. The Constitution even prohibited states from issuing it. The wounds were too fresh, the memory of worthless paper too painful. But history has a way of forcing nations to confront what they fear most. And in 1861, America faced a crisis that would make paper money not just acceptable, but absolutely necessary. The Civil War tore America apart, brother against brother, state against state. And underneath all the tragedy and heroism, there was a very practical problem. Wars are expensive, extraordinarily expensive. The Union needed to feed, clothe, arm, and pay hundreds of thousands of soldiers. It needed ships and cannons and horses and ammunition. It needed to build an industrial war machine capable of defeating the Confederacy, and the federal treasury was nearly empty. Gold and silver reserves were modest. Borrowing had limits. Raising taxes takes time that a nation at war doesn't have. Treasury Secretary Salmon P. Chase, the same man whose face would later appear on the $10,000 bill, faced an impossible situation. He needed money, vast amounts of money, and there was only one way to create it quickly enough. In 1862, Congress passed the Legal Tender Act, authorizing the Treasury to print paper currency. These notes were officially called United States notes, but everyone called them by another name: greenbacks. The nickname came from the distinctive green ink used on the reverse side. It was a practical choice. Green ink was harder to counterfeit with the photography technology of the time, but it gave the currency a memorable identity that persists in language even today. These greenbacks were something America hadn't seen since the Continental Congress. Government-issued paper money, not backed by gold, not redeemable for precious metals, simply declared to be legal tender, meaning everyone had to accept them for payment of debts. Fiat currency, born from desperation, the same dangerous path that had led to not worth the Continental. And yet, this time was different. Yes, there was inflation. Prices rose significantly during the war. At their lowest point, greenbacks traded at just 35 cents in gold value. People grumbled. Merchants complained. The uncertainty was real. But the currency held. It didn't collapse entirely. It didn't become worthless kindling. Why? Several reasons. The Union was winning the war, which gave confidence in its survival. The government was more sophisticated than the Continental Congress had been. There were limits, imperfect but real, on how many greenbacks could be printed. And crucially, people believed that after the war, things would stabilize. The Confederacy had its own paper money. Confederate dollars rolled off Southern presses in enormous quantities, backed by nothing but faith in a cause that was losing. By 1865, Confederate currency was worthless. Completely, utterly worthless. The South experienced what the Continental Congress had experienced, the total collapse of unbacked paper money. But this time, it happened to the losing side, which only reinforced Northern confidence that their system was superior. The greenbacks survived the war. They were battered, discounted, and distrusted, but they survived. Now the question became, what happens next? With the war over, Americans faced a profound question. What should money be? Should the greenbacks be withdrawn, burned, replaced entirely with gold-backed currency, or should paper money remain, flexible and expandable, able to grow with the economy? This debate would consume American politics for the next 30 years. It sounds technical and boring, but it was anything but. This was a fight about the very nature of wealth, about who benefits when money is scarce versus when it's plentiful, about power itself. On one side stood the sound money advocates, bankers, creditors, Eastern financial interests. They wanted a return to the gold standard. Currency backed by metal, limited in supply, stable in value. If you had lent someone $100, you wanted to be repaid in dollars worth exactly what they were when you lent them. Inflation was theft, in their view. Paper money was dangerous. On the other side stood farmers, debtors, Western and Southern interests, people who owed money rather than being owed. If you'd borrowed $100 to buy your farm, deflation was your enemy. When prices fell, your crops sold for less, but your debt stayed the same. You were being crushed by money that grew more valuable while your labor grew less so. These people wanted more currency in circulation. Paper money, silver coinage, anything to ease the deflationary pressure that was strangling rural America. In 1873, Congress passed a law that removed silver from the monetary system, a technical change that dramatically reduced the potential money supply. Critics called it the crime of 1873. They believed bankers had conspired to impoverish ordinary Americans by restricting currency. The battle raged for decades. In 1896, it reached a climax. William Jennings Bryan, a young congressman from Nebraska, gave one of the most famous speeches in American political history at the Democratic National Convention. "You shall not press down upon the brow of labor this crown of thorns," he thundered. "You shall not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold." Bryan lost the election. The gold standard won. But the passion of that speech reminds us that money is never just about economics. It's about justice, about whose interests the system serves, about whether the rules are fair. These are questions we still ask today. In 1879, the United States officially returned to the gold standard. Greenbacks were now convertible. You could walk into a bank with paper money and walk out with gold coins. This was supposed to end the debates. Paper money was real now, backed by metal, safe. For a generation, it seemed to work. The economy grew. Industry expanded. America transformed from an agricultural nation into an industrial powerhouse. The dollar was trusted at home and respected abroad. But the gold standard had a cost. The money supply could only grow as fast as gold supplies grew. When economic activity wanted to expand faster than gold permitted, credit tightened. Businesses failed. Workers lost jobs. The economy contracted, not because anything was wrong with production or demand, but because there simply wasn't enough money to facilitate exchange. Sound familiar? It's the same problem that plagued ancient civilizations with metal coins. And there were panics, terrible panics. 1893, banks failed by the hundreds. Unemployment soared. The economy collapsed into depression. 1907, a stock market crash triggered a banking crisis. Lines formed outside banks as depositors desperately tried to withdraw their savings. Many banks couldn't pay. The paper money they'd issued became worthless. The gold standard provided stability, but it was a brittle stability. When it cracked, it shattered. After each crisis, there were calls for reform, for some kind of system that could prevent these devastating panics, for a lender of last resort that could stop bank runs before they destroyed the economy. The answer would take decades to emerge. The Panic of 1907 was the last straw. That crisis was only contained because J.P. Morgan, a private banker, personally organized a rescue. He locked the leading financiers of New York in his library and refused to let them leave until they'd pledged their own money to stop the panic. It worked, but it was absurd. The stability of the American economy had depended on one man's willpower and wealth. In 1913, after years of debate and compromise, Congress passed the Federal Reserve Act. This created a new institution, the Federal Reserve System. A central bank, though Americans were careful not to call it that. The word bank was deliberately left out of the title. Too controversial, too reminiscent of the Bank of the United States that Andrew Jackson had destroyed decades earlier. The Federal Reserve would issue a new form of paper money. Federal Reserve notes. These are what you have in your wallet right now, more than a century later. What made them different? Uniform design. Every note looked the same, whether issued in Boston or San Francisco. No more confusion about whose paper was trustworthy. Government backing. The full faith and credit of the United States stood behind these notes. They weren't promises from private banks that might fail. Nationwide acceptance. Legal tender everywhere. A truly national currency at last. The Fed could also manage the money supply more flexibly than the rigid gold standard had allowed. By adjusting interest rates and lending to banks in crisis, it could smooth out the boom and bust cycles that had plagued American finance. At least, that was the theory. The notes were still backed by gold, still convertible, still tied to that ancient metal. But there was more flexibility now, more room to respond to economic conditions. For 15 years, the system seemed to work beautifully. The 1920s roared. Prosperity spread. The Federal Reserve congratulated itself on having solved the problems of money. Then came 1929. The stock market crash of October 1929 triggered the worst economic catastrophe in American history. Banks failed, thousands of them. People lost their savings overnight. Businesses collapsed. Unemployment reached 25%. The American dream became an American nightmare. The Federal Reserve failed. It was supposed to prevent exactly this kind of disaster. Instead, it made mistakes that deepened the crisis. It tightened the money supply when it should have loosened it. It let banks fail when it should have saved them. The gold standard was part of the problem. It limited what the government could do to fight the depression. Every dollar had to be backed by gold. If you wanted to expand the money supply to stimulate the economy, you needed more gold. But there wasn't more gold. There's never more gold than what exists. In 1933, Franklin Roosevelt took a radical step. Executive Order 6102 required all American citizens to turn in their gold coins, gold bullion, and gold certificates. In exchange, they received paper money. The gold became government property. Private gold ownership became illegal, a crime. punishable by fines and imprisonment. This sounds shocking today. The government confiscating private gold? It happened. It happened here, within living memory for some people still alive. Why? Because Roosevelt needed freedom to expand the money supply. He needed to fight the Depression with every tool available. And as long as dollars were convertible to gold, his hands were tied. With Americans no longer able to demand gold for their paper money, the government could print more currency. It could fund public works. It could try to restart the economy. The dollar was now fiat currency for domestic purposes, valuable because the government said so, backed by nothing but trust. The same arrangement that had destroyed continentals. The same arrangement that had ruined Chinese paper money and French assignats, but this time it held. The institutions were stronger. The management was more sophisticated. The economy eventually recovered. Americans got used to paper money that wasn't backed by gold. They had no choice. And slowly, they stopped thinking about it. Money was money. It worked. What more did you need to know? After World War II, the United States was the dominant economic power on Earth. Europe was devastated. Japan was devastated. But America had emerged stronger than ever. In 1944, representatives from 44 countries gathered at Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, to create a new international monetary system. The system they designed placed the US dollar at the center of global finance. Other currencies would be pegged to the dollar. The dollar would be pegged to gold, but only for foreign governments, not for individuals. If France or Britain wanted to exchange their dollars for gold, they could. If you or I wanted to, we couldn't. We were stuck with paper. This system made the dollar the world's reserve currency. Central banks everywhere held dollars. International trade was conducted in dollars. America had a privilege no other nation enjoyed: the ability to print the currency that everyone else needed. For 25 years, Bretton Woods worked. Global trade expanded. Economies grew. The system held. But there was a problem. A slow motion problem. The United States was printing more dollars than its gold reserves could support. Vietnam War spending, Great Society programs, trade deficits, more and more dollars flowing out into the world. Foreign governments started to worry. Were there really enough gold bars in Fort Knox to back all these dollars? What if everyone demanded their gold at once? By the late 1960s, the worry became action. France, in particular, began demanding gold for its dollar holdings. Plane after plane carried gold bars from New York to Paris. America's gold reserves were draining away. On August 15, 1971, President Richard Nixon appeared on television to make an announcement that would change the world. The United States would no longer redeem dollars for gold, not for foreign governments, not for anyone. The last link between paper money and precious metals, a link that stretched back thousands of years, was severed. Dollars were now pure fiat currency, valuable because people believed they were valuable, because the US government said so, because the economy they represented was strong and productive. Nixon called it temporary. It wasn't. The gold window never reopened. Many predicted disaster. Without gold backing, what would stop inflation? What would maintain confidence? Why would anyone trust paper that represented nothing but a promise? But the disaster didn't come. At least, not immediately. The system held. The dollar remained the world's reserve currency. International trade continued. The global economy adapted to money without metal. This was the final transformation. After centuries of experimentation, paper money had evolved into something the Chinese innovators of the Song dynasty might have recognized. Currency backed by nothing but government authority and public trust. Full circle, but with better institutions, better technology, and hard-won knowledge about the dangers of overprinting. Today, the Federal Reserve manages the dollar with tools that would have seemed like magic to earlier generations. Interest rates can be raised or lowered to speed up or slow down the economy. The money supply can be expanded or contracted as conditions require. Sophisticated analysis guides decisions that affect billions of people. There's no gold backing, none at all, just the full faith and credit of the United States government, the productivity of the American economy, the trust of people around the world who hold dollars as their savings, their reserves, their hedge against uncertainty. The dollar is still the world's primary reserve currency. Central banks from Tokyo to Frankfurt hold trillions of dollars. International oil is priced in dollars. Global trade runs on dollars. The physical notes themselves are marvels of anti-counterfeiting technology. Security threads embedded in the paper. Watermarks visible when held to light. Color-shifting ink that changes from copper to green. Microprinting too small to reproduce with ordinary copiers. The designs change every 7 to 10 years, staying ahead of counterfeiters in an endless technological race. Does the system work? Mostly, yes. Americans have experienced nothing like the hyperinflation that destroyed currencies in Germany or Zimbabwe. The dollar has been remarkably stable for decades, but not perfectly stable. The 1970s brought stagflation, high inflation, and high unemployment together. Prices doubled over that decade. The purchasing power of savings eroded. Even sophisticated central banking can't prevent all problems. The tools are better, but they're not perfect. Money remains, as it has always been, a matter of trust, and trust can be damaged. So why does paper money work today when it failed so often in the past? Institutional credibility. The Federal Reserve has over a century of history. It makes mistakes, but it learns from them. It's independent from day-to-day politics, focused on long-term stability. Legal tender laws. You must accept dollars for debts. This universal acceptance creates a foundation of reliability. Economic strength. The U.S. economy is vast and productive. Dollars represent claims on real goods and services produced by real people. Global integration. So many people around the world hold dollars that everyone has an interest in maintaining their value. None of this is guaranteed forever. History teaches us that every monetary system eventually changes or fails. The dollar's dominance may not last another century. But for now, the system works. Americans carry paper rectangles, or increasingly, digital representations of paper rectangles, and trust that they'll be able to exchange them for food, shelter, and everything else they need. It took centuries to get here. So much trial and error, so much disaster. Think about everything that had to happen. Chinese innovation, European banking, continental collapse, Civil War necessity, gold standard rigidity, Depression-era transformation. The final break from metal in 1971. Each step built on what came before. Each failure taught lessons. Each success provided a foundation for further experimentation. The dollar in your wallet, or the digital dollars in your bank account, represents all of that history, compressed into something so ordinary that you probably never think about it. But it wasn't obvious. It wasn't natural. It was invented, refined, and perfected over 1,000 years of human effort. So after centuries of experimentation, disaster, and refinement, America finally had stable paper money. But just as we perfected paper currency, technology was about to make it obsolete. So far, our story has centered on two main threads: China's early invention and abandonment of paper money, and America's chaotic journey from continentals to greenbacks. But money doesn't respect borders. While America was lurching from disaster to disaster, the rest of the world was conducting its own experiments with paper currency. Some succeeded brilliantly, others failed catastrophically. A few created economic traumas so severe they shaped national psychology for generations. Today, we're taking a world tour of paper money, the good, the bad, and the absolutely insane, because the lessons from these global experiments remain startlingly relevant, even now. Let's start with the most spectacular failure in European monetary history. France, 1716. The kingdom is bankrupt. King Louis XIV's endless wars have emptied the treasury. The economy is stagnant. Gold and silver are scarce. Enter John Law, a Scottish gambler, mathematician, convicted murderer. He killed a man in a duel, and self-proclaimed financial genius. Law had an idea. France's problem wasn't lack of wealth, but lack of money. Create paper currency, and commerce would flourish. The economy would grow. Everyone would prosper. He convinced the Duke of Orleans, regent for the young King Louis V, to let him try. Law created the Banque Générale, which issued paper notes. Unlike colonial American bills backed by vague promises, Law's notes were supposedly backed by something tangible: the future wealth of Louisiana. Yes, Louisiana, the French colony covering roughly a third of what would become the United States. Law's Mississippi Company held exclusive trading rights to this vast territory. His paper money would be backed by the gold, silver, and endless resources that surely lay waiting in the American wilderness. At first, it worked brilliantly. Paper money flowed. The economy revived. The Mississippi Company's stock soared. Law became the richest man in Europe. People camped outside his house, begging to invest. Then Law made the fatal error that every paper money issuer eventually faces. He printed more, and more, and more. The money supply exploded. Prices rose. People began questioning whether Louisiana actually contained enough wealth to back all this paper. Spoiler, it didn't. Louisiana was mostly swamps and forests, not mountains of gold. In 1720, the bubble burst. Mississippi Company stock collapsed. Paper money became worthless almost overnight. People who had traded their gold and silver for paper found themselves holding nothing. Fortunes evaporated. Suicides swept Paris. The paper money became so worthless that people burned it for heat. Literally. It was worth more as fuel than as currency. John Law fled France in disguise. He died in poverty in Venice 9 years later. And France? France became so traumatized by this disaster that it didn't seriously attempt paper money again for nearly 70 years, which brings us to their second catastrophe. The French Revolution exploded in 1789. The revolutionary government faced a familiar problem: no money to fund their new republic. But they had something else: massive amounts of church property, confiscated from the Catholic Church. The revolutionaries created assignats, paper currency backed by this seized land. In theory, you could exchange assignats for actual property, real backing. What could go wrong? Everything. everything could go wrong. The government printed assignats to fund the revolution, then printed more to fund wars against European monarchies trying to crush them. Then printed more because, well, printing was easier than collecting taxes from chaos. By 1796, the assignat had lost 99% of its value. Prices rose by factors of thousands. Workers demanded payment in bread rather than currency because bread, at least, had actual value. The Directory government finally abandoned assignat entirely, introducing a new currency called the mandats territoriaux. These failed too. France limped back to metal coinage, having proven to its own citizens that paper money was essentially a scam. Two massive paper money disasters in a century. Is it any wonder French people became famously conservative about money? The phrase, "not worth an assignat," entered the French language the same way "not worth a continental" entered American English. Some lessons you have to learn twice. Meanwhile, across the English Channel, the British were taking a different approach. The Bank of England, founded in 1694, issued banknotes. But unlike John Law's fantastical schemes or the revolutionaries' desperation printing, the bank operated conservatively. Notes were technically convertible to gold on demand. The bank maintained reserves. It didn't, mostly, print more than it could back. When the Napoleonic Wars strained finances, Britain did suspend gold convertibility in 1797. For 24 years, the pound floated without metal backing. Some inflation occurred, but nothing like France's disasters. Why? Partly discipline. Partly that Britain's economy was genuinely productive. Partly that the Bank of England had built decades of credibility. When peace returned in 1821, Britain resumed gold convertibility. The pound remained rock solid, backed by gold, until the crises of the 20th century. The British approach, cautious, gradual, backed by real reserves and genuine economic strength, became the model for successful paper money worldwide. But not everyone followed the model. Germany, 1921. The First World War is over. Germany lost. The Treaty of Versailles demands crushing reparations, payments to the victors that Germany cannot afford. The German government faces impossible choices. It cannot collect enough taxes. It cannot borrow enough money. So it does what desperate governments always do. It prints. What followed was the most famous hyperinflation in modern history. In 1921, $1 was worth about 90 German marks. By November 1923, $1 was worth 4.2 trillion marks. Let me make that concrete. Prices doubled every few days. Workers were paid twice daily, because if you waited until the end of the day, your morning wages couldn't buy lunch. People carried money in wheelbarrows, baskets, suitcases. The bills themselves weighed more than the goods they purchased. The government printed 100 trillion mark notes, not as a joke, as actual currency. A loaf of bread that cost 250 marks in January 1923 cost 200 billion marks by November. Middle-class Germans who had saved their entire lives, who had money in bank accounts, government bonds, insurance policies, watched everything evaporate. A lifetime of thrift, responsibility, playing by the rules, worthless. The social trauma was profound. An entire generation learned that paper money was a lie, that saving was for fools, that the government would betray you. Some historians argue this trauma helped pave the way for extremism. When you destroy people's savings, you destroy their faith in the system. and desperate people turn to desperate solutions. Germany eventually stabilized with a new currency, the Rentenmark, backed by land and industrial assets, but the scars remained. To this day, German economic policy is shaped by Weimar's ghost. The Bundesbank's obsession with inflation control, Germany's insistence on fiscal discipline in the European Union, these trace directly back to those wheelbarrows of worthless paper. Some traumas last for generations. Not every story is a disaster. Japan, 1868. The Meiji Restoration transforms the country from feudal isolation to rapid modernization. The new government understood that a modern economy required modern money. In 1871, they introduced the yen, a decimal currency system modeled on Western examples. Japan studied other countries' monetary histories. They saw France's disasters, Britain's successes, America's chaos. They learned from others' mistakes. Initially, Japan faced inflation problems. The transition wasn't smooth, but by 1882, they established the Bank of Japan, a central bank modeled on European institutions. The yen stabilized. Japan industrialized. Within a generation, a feudal society had become an economic power with a functioning modern currency. The lesson? When you're building a monetary system from scratch, it helps to study what worked elsewhere. Japan was humble enough to learn. Not everyone is. Latin America, throughout the 20th century, provided a masterclass in how paper money fails. Argentina, Brazil, Chile, Bolivia, Peru. One country after another experienced currency collapse. The pattern was depressingly consistent. Political instability, populist governments spending more than they collected, central banks pressured to print money to cover deficits, inflation spiraling, currency collapsing, new currency introduced, cycle repeats. Argentina alone has had multiple currency replacements. The peso ley, the peso argentino, the austral, the peso convertible, each introduced to replace a currency destroyed by inflation. Brazil went through the cruzeiro, cruzado, cruzado novo, cruzeiro again, cruzeiro real, and finally the real, 6 currencies in 3 decades. Some countries gave up entirely. Ecuador adopted the US dollar in 2000 after its own currency collapsed. El Salvador did the same in 2001. When a country abandons its own currency for someone else's, it's admitting something profound. We cannot trust ourselves with the power to print money. That's humiliating, but it's also honest. Paper money requires discipline. It requires institutions strong enough to resist the temptation to print. When those institutions fail, the currency fails. But that's all history, you might think. Modern economies know better. Allow me to introduce Zimbabwe 2007 to 2009. Robert Mugabe's government faced economic collapse, partly from sanctions, partly from disastrous land reform policies, partly from corruption. Their solution? Print money. What followed made Weimar look restrained. At its peak, Zimbabwe's inflation rate was estimated at 79.6 billion% per month. Prices doubled every 24 hours. The government printed a $100 trillion note, the largest denomination banknote ever issued. It was worth about 40 US cents. People stopped using Zimbabwean currency entirely. They switched to US dollars, South African rand, anything with actual value. The economy dollarized informally because the official currency had become a joke. In 2009, Zimbabwe officially abandoned its own currency. They didn't reintroduce a Zimbabwean dollar until 2019, and even then, people remain skeptical. This wasn't ancient history. This happened while you probably owned a smartphone. Hyperinflation isn't a historical curiosity. It's a constant threat when governments abuse the power to create money. So what do we learn from this global tour? First, the temptation to print money is universal. French kings, German republics, African dictators, Latin American populists, they all faced the same temptation, and most succumbed. Second, hyperinflation isn't just economic damage, it's social trauma. It destroys trust in money, in institutions, in the future itself. Societies that experience it carry scars for generations. Third, successful paper money requires more than just printing presses. It requires discipline, strong institutions, rule of law, economic productivity, and above all, credibility, the belief that the government won't abuse its power. Fourth, even today, these lessons must be constantly relearned. Venezuela, Zimbabwe, and others prove that modern economies aren't immune. The countries that got it right, Britain, eventually America, Japan, Germany after its trauma, built institutions specifically designed to resist the temptation. Central banks with independence, constitutional constraints, cultural memories of what happens when discipline fails. Here's the fundamental truth about paper money, demonstrated across centuries and continents. It's incredibly useful. Paper currency enables commerce that metal coins cannot. It allows economies to grow beyond the limits of gold and silver supplies. It's one of humanity's most important inventions, but it's also incredibly dangerous. The power to create money is the power to steal, silently, invisibly, from everyone who holds that money. And governments, facing hard choices, will always be tempted to take the easy path. Paper money works only as long as people trust it. That trust is hard to build and easy to destroy. And now, in our modern age, even paper money might be becoming obsolete. We're already seeing the rise of digital currencies, money that exists only as numbers in computers, some issued by governments, some by no one in particular. What happens when money isn't even paper anymore? When it's just information? In our next segment, we'll bring this journey to the present day and ask, where is money going next? And what lessons from history should we carry with us into this digital future? We've traveled through centuries of monetary evolution, from heavy copper coins strung on cords to paper promises backed by imperial decree, from continental dollars worth nothing to Federal Reserve notes trusted worldwide. And now we arrive at perhaps the strangest chapter of all. The money we worked so hard to perfect is disappearing. The first cracks in cash's dominance appeared in 1950. A businessman named Frank McNamara found himself at a New York restaurant without enough cash to pay his bill. The embarrassment sparked an idea. What if there was a card, a piece of plastic, that let you pay now and settle up later? The Diners Club card was born, a simple concept. You showed the card, signed a slip, and the restaurant billed you at the end of the month. It wasn't credit in the modern sense, more like a convenient tab, but it planted a seed. In 1958, Bank of America mailed unsolicited credit cards to 60,000 residents of Fresno, California. Many people were confused. Some were outraged, but enough people used them that the experiment succeeded. By the 1970s and 80s, credit cards had become common. That thin piece of plastic in your wallet meant you didn't need to carry large amounts of cash. You could buy now and pay later. The convenience was intoxicating. Then came debit cards in the 1980s and 90s. These connected directly to your bank account. No borrowing involved, just instant access to your own money anywhere a merchant had a card reader. And ATMs, automated teller machines, sprouted on street corners everywhere. Need cash at midnight? No problem. The machine would dispense crisp bills any hour of the day. But here's the thing. All of these innovations still represented paper money. The cash existed. It sat in bank vaults or circulated in the economy. Credit and debit cards were just convenient ways to access it without carrying it physically. The bills were still there, still real, still paper. That was about to change. In the 1990s and 2000s, banking moved online. At first, it seemed like just another convenience. You could check your balance without visiting a branch. You could transfer money between accounts with a few clicks. You could pay bills without writing checks or buying stamps. Simple improvements. Time savers. But something profound was happening beneath the surface. When your employer started using direct deposit, your paycheck stopped being a physical object. No more paper check to hold, to examine, to carry to the bank. Just a notification that numbers had changed in a database somewhere. When you paid your rent online, no cash changed hands. No check was written. Just numbers moving from your account to your landlord's account. Entries in electronic ledgers. Think about this carefully. When did you last see your salary? Not the number on a screen, the actual money. The physical currency that represents your hours of labor. For most people, the answer is never. Your paycheck exists only as data. It arrives as data. It leaves as data when you pay your bills. It might become physical cash only if you deliberately visit an ATM and withdraw it. Money became abstract in a way it had never been before. A medieval merchant could hold his wealth in his hands, feel the weight of coins, lock them in a chest, and know exactly where his money was. You cannot hold your bank balance. You cannot lock it away. It exists as magnetic patterns on a hard drive somewhere, replicated across backup systems, protected by encryption and passwords and security protocols you'll never see or understand. Your life savings are database entries. This is a strange form of trust when you think about it. We trust that the numbers on the screen accurately represent something real. We trust that when we need that money, the system will deliver it. And mostly it does. But the abstraction is so complete that money has become almost imaginary. Then smartphones arrived, and the transformation accelerated beyond anything the early digital pioneers imagined. Apple Pay, Google Pay, Samsung Pay, you don't even need a card anymore. Just wave your phone near a terminal. The payment happens through wireless magic, near-field communication technically, but it might as well be sorcery to most users. Venmo and PayPal and Zelle made it possible to send money to friends instantly. Split a dinner bill? Venmo them your share before you leave the restaurant. Owe someone $20? Send it from your phone while you're still talking to them. Cash became awkward, inconvenient. Who carries cash anymore? Younger generations, those who grew up with smartphones in their hands, often don't carry cash at all. They've never needed to. Every transaction they've ever made could be handled digitally. They look at paper money the way we might look at tally sticks. Quaint, historical, unnecessary. In some countries, this transition is nearly complete. Sweden, yes, The same Sweden that issued Europe's first banknotes in 1661 is now one of the most cashless societies on earth. Many Swedish banks no longer handle cash at all. Some businesses refuse it. Churches accept donations via smartphone app. South Korea is similar. China has leaped from a heavily cash-based society to one where even street vendors prefer digital payment. A phone scan and you're done. The COVID-19 pandemic accelerated this trend worldwide. Suddenly, handling physical money, touching something that countless other hands had touched, seemed dangerous. Contactless payment went from convenient to preferred to sometimes mandatory. Some stores stopped accepting cash entirely. Legal tender laws were bent or ignored. Paper money, which had served humanity for over 1,000 years, became suspicious, possibly contaminated, best avoided. The death of cash isn't coming. It's already here. It's just not evenly distributed yet. Let's pause and consider what disappears when cash disappears. First, tangibility. There's something psychologically important about holding money, about counting bills, about feeling your wallet grow lighter as you spend. Physical cash makes the cost of things real in a way that tapping a screen never can. Studies show that people spend more freely with cards than with cash. The pain of payment is dulled when you don't actually hand anything over. The money doesn't feel quite real. Parents trying to teach children about money face new challenges. How do you explain saving when money is invisible? How do you give an allowance in a cashless world? How do you make a child understand that the number on a screen represents real value? Second, privacy. Cash is anonymous. A $10 bill doesn't know who spent it or what it bought. It carries no history, leaves no trail. Digital payments are the opposite. Every transaction is recorded. Your bank knows what you bought, where you bought it, when you bought it. Credit card companies build detailed profiles of your habits. This data is analyzed, sold, used to target advertising. You might not care. You might have nothing to hide. But the loss of financial privacy is profound nonetheless. Every purchase you make becomes part of a permanent record somewhere. Every donation, every subscription, every embarrassing late-night impulse buy. Third, independence from systems. Cash works when the power is out, when the internet is down, when the banking system is disrupted. Digital money requires functioning infrastructure. Servers must be online. Networks must be operational. Your device must have battery power. In a disaster, a hurricane, an earthquake, a cyber attack, digital payment systems might fail. Cash keeps working until the paper itself is destroyed. These losses are real. They matter. But they exist alongside genuine gains. Digital money is convenient in ways cash never could be. Speed. A transaction that might have taken days, writing a check, mailing it, waiting for it to clear, now happens in seconds. Money moves at the speed of light. Safety. You can't be pickpocketed if you're not carrying cash. A stolen credit card can be cancelled. A stolen $100 bill is simply gone. Fraud protection. If someone steals your card number and makes fraudulent charges, the bank will typically reverse them. Cash offers no such recourse. Record keeping. Every digital transaction creates a record. Tax preparation becomes simpler. Budgeting becomes easier. You can see exactly where your money went. International transactions. Sending money overseas. Once an expensive ordeal involving wire transfers and currency exchanges and days of waiting, now happens almost instantly. For businesses, Digital payment means less risk of employee theft, no need to make nightly cash deposits, no risk of armed robbery. The advantages are substantial. The gains are real too. Progress rarely comes without trade-offs. But we need to talk about something uncomfortable. When every transaction is digital, every transaction is visible. And not just to you. Governments can access financial records. They can track where you shop, what you buy, who you send money to. In theory, this power is limited by law, requiring warrants and judicial oversight. In practice, the boundaries are often blurry. Companies collect and analyze this data constantly. Your spending patterns reveal your habits, your preferences, your secrets. This information has value. It's bought and sold in ways most consumers never see. Consider China's social credit system. Digital payments are integrated into a vast surveillance apparatus. Your purchases, your associations, your behaviors all contribute to a score that can affect your ability to travel, to get loans, to live a normal life. Most people reading this live in countries where such systems don't exist. But the infrastructure to create them does exist. Every digital payment system is also, potentially, a surveillance system. Financial censorship becomes possible in ways it never was with cash. Accounts can be frozen. Transactions can be blocked. A person or organization can be cut off from the financial system entirely, unable to buy food or pay rent. This power might be used against terrorists and criminals. It might also be used against dissidents and protesters. The technology is neutral. How it's used depends on who controls it. Cash provided a kind of freedom we took for granted. The freedom to transact without permission, without surveillance, without the possibility of being switched off. That freedom is eroding. In 2009, in the depths of the financial crisis, a mysterious figure, using the name Satoshi Nakamoto, released something new into the world: Bitcoin. The idea was radical. A digital currency controlled by no government, no central bank, no institution of any kind. Money created and maintained by a distributed network of computers, using cryptographic techniques to verify transactions and prevent counterfeiting. Decentralized, anonymous, or at least pseudonymous. Beyond the reach of any authority. For believers, cryptocurrency represented the future. A return to the freedom that cash provided, but in digital form. Money that couldn't be inflated at a government's whim. Money that couldn't be censored or controlled. For critics, it represented speculation and chaos. Bitcoin's value swings wildly, up thousands of %, then down by half, then up again. It's not stable enough to function as actual currency. Most people who hold it are betting on price appreciation, not using it to buy groceries. The environmental concerns are significant. The computer processing required to maintain the Bitcoin network consumes more electricity than many countries. Other cryptocurrencies have addressed this problem with different technical approaches, but the energy consumption of the original remains troubling. Cryptocurrency occupies a strange space in the story of money. It's clearly part of the evolution, clearly an experiment, clearly something new. But whether it's the future of money or a speculative bubble or somehow both remains unclear. Some countries have embraced it. El Salvador adopted Bitcoin as legal tender in 2021, a bold experiment whose results are still unfolding. Other countries have banned it entirely. China, ironically the birthplace of paper money, has outlawed cryptocurrency trading and mining. The experiment continues. While cryptocurrency enthusiasts dream of decentralized money. Governments are moving in the opposite direction. Central bank digital currencies, CBDCs, are digital money issued by governments, not Bitcoin's decentralized dream. The opposite, fully centralized, fully controlled, fully tracked. China's digital yuan is already in circulation. Millions of people use it daily. It works like cash in the sense that it's direct central bank money, but it's trackable in ways cash never was. The United States, Europe, and many other nations are developing their own versions. Within a decade, CBDCs may become common worldwide. This would complete the transition we've been discussing. If governments issue digital currency that works better than cash, faster, more convenient, integrated into payment systems, physical money might truly become obsolete. Banks might change fundamentally. Much of what banks do is create and manage money. If the central bank offers digital accounts directly to citizens, what role remains for commercial banks? The questions this raises are profound. A government with a CBDC could implement monetary policy with unprecedented precision. Want to stimulate spending? Make the digital currency expire if not used within a certain time. Want to prevent capital flight? Program the currency to be unusable outside national borders. The possibilities are extraordinary and perhaps terrifying. Money has always been political, but digital government money could be political in ways that paper never was. Every feature becomes a policy choice. Every restriction becomes technologically enforceable. We may be approaching a world where the nature of money itself is programmable, controllable, conditional. Step back for a moment and appreciate the irony. Humanity spent 1,000 years learning to trust paper money. We failed repeatedly. We tried again. We refined our institutions, improved our technology, built systems sophisticated enough to make worthless paper function as reliable currency. And just as we finally got it right, we're abandoning it. Children born today may never use cash in any meaningful way. They'll grow up with money that exists only as numbers, accessed through devices, manipulated through apps. The physical dollar bill will be as foreign to them as a silver denarius or a copper gyozzi. They won't understand why we call money paper, why we talk about minting coins or printing currency. These will become dead metaphors, fossils of a physical reality that no longer exists. The journey from tally sticks to Bitcoin took thousands of years. The journey from widespread cash to predominantly digital money is taking decades, maybe less. We are living through a transformation as significant as the invention of paper money itself, but it's happening so quickly, so gradually in our daily experience that we barely notice. I can't answer that question for you. Perhaps no one can. Digital money brings efficiency and convenience. It makes commerce faster and friction-free. It includes people who live far from banks in the financial system. Digital money also brings surveillance and control. It creates dependencies on functioning infrastructure. It eliminates the anonymous, permissionless transactions that cash made possible. Both things are true simultaneously. The transition is happening whether we embrace it or resist it. Market forces and technological momentum are pushing in one direction. Individual preferences matter, but they won't stop the tide. Paper money may become a historical curiosity within our lifetimes, something you see in museums, something you explain to grandchildren who can't quite believe people once carried physical tokens to exchange for goods. And maybe that's fine. Money has always evolved. Shells gave way to metal, gave way to paper, gave way to whatever comes next. Each transition felt strange to those who lived through it. Each new form of money seemed suspicious until it became normal. From copper coins too heavy to carry, to paper money that seemed like magic, to digital numbers that exist only in computer memory, money has always been evolving. And maybe that's the point. Money isn't really about the paper or the metal or the bytes, it's about trust. And as long as we trust the system, whatever form money takes will work until we don't. We've traveled a long road today, from Chinese merchants, tired of carrying heavy copper coins, to Italian bankers inventing letters of credit, to American revolutionaries watching their currency become worthless, to the digital transactions flowing invisibly around us right now. Before we move on, I want to pause, to step back from the history and ask a deeper question. What is money really? Not how it works, not where it came from, but what it fundamentally is. The answer, when you really examine it, is stranger than you might expect. Take out a bill from your wallet, any denomination. Look at it. Really look. What are you holding? A piece of paper. Cotton and linen fibers technically. Some ink. Some security features. A picture of someone who died long ago. This object has no intrinsic value. You can't eat it. You can't build shelter with it. You can't wear it. As a physical object, it's essentially worthless. And yet, you can exchange this piece of paper for food, clothing, shelter, anything humans produce or provide. You can trade this intrinsically worthless object for hours of someone's labor, for goods shipped from the other side of the planet, for experiences and services of every imaginable kind. How? Why? Because we all agree that it has value. Money is a shared illusion, a collective fiction, a story we all tell each other and choose to believe. That sounds dismissive, but it's not. Shared fictions are among the most powerful forces in human civilization. Nations are shared fictions. Laws are shared fictions. Human rights are shared fictions. They're real because we make them real through collective belief. Money is perhaps the most successful shared fiction ever created. But shared fictions require something to sustain them. That something is trust. Every form of money throughout history has required trust to function. When you accept a dollar bill, you're trusting that tomorrow someone else will also accept it. You're trusting that the government won't print so many dollars that yours become worthless. You're trusting in an entire institutional framework that you probably never think about. When trust holds, money works. Seamlessly, invisibly. We don't even notice it. When trust breaks, money fails. Instantly, catastrophically. We saw it in Weimar Germany, marks becoming worthless by the hour. In Zimbabwe, $100 trillion notes worth pennies. In revolutionary America, continentals used as wallpaper. In each case, the physical money didn't change. The paper was the same paper. The ink was the same ink. What changed was the belief. People stopped trusting that others would accept it. And the moment enough people stopped believing, the money died. Trust is the architecture upon which all money rests. Without it, paper money is just paper. Digital money is just numbers. Even gold is just a soft yellow metal with limited practical uses. We sometimes speak of hard money versus soft money, but all money ultimately is soft. It's all built on the shifting sands of human belief. Here's what makes paper money and its digital descendants both revolutionary and dangerous. Governments discovered they could create money, not dig it out of the ground, not trade for it, just create it, print it, type it into existence. This power is intoxicating. Facing a war? Print money. Need to build infrastructure? Print money. Want to win an election? Print money for popular programs. The temptation is always there. And throughout history, governments have succumbed. Again and again. Because here's the dark truth about printing money: it works. In the short term, it solves immediate problems. The costs, inflation, currency depreciation, come later. They're paid by different people, often in different times. Inflation is a hidden tax. When governments print money, they're effectively taking value from everyone who holds that currency. But it's invisible. There's no tax bill, no vote, just slowly rising prices that people blame on greedy merchants or bad luck. Stable money requires resisting temptation. It requires governments to accept constraints on their own power. That's hard. That's why so few societies have managed it consistently. And yet, despite all the failures, look at what paper money enabled. Before paper currency, economies were constrained by the physical supply of precious metals. Trade was limited by what coins you could carry. Investment was constrained by hoarding. Paper money broke those constraints. It allowed economic growth to explode beyond anything our ancestors could have imagined. It enabled global trade at scales previously impossible. It allowed complex financial instruments, credit systems, investment vehicles that fuel modern capitalism. Every modern economy, every factory, every technology company, every hospital and school rests on this abstraction. Remove paper money and its digital successors, and civilization as we know it collapses. We built our entire world on colored paper with numbers printed on it, and now, increasingly, on numbers that exist only as magnetic patterns in computer systems. That's either humanity's greatest achievement or its most precarious gamble, probably both. And the evolution isn't over. Paper money itself may be a brief phase in monetary history. Think about it. Humanity used commodity money for millennia, coins for about 2,500 years, paper money a few centuries in the West. Even in China, where it was invented, it was eventually abandoned and revived. Now paper is already giving way to digital. Most money today never exists in physical form. It's created digitally, transferred digitally, held digitally. The paper in your wallet is almost an anachronism. What comes next? Central bank digital currencies, government money that exists purely as data, cryptocurrencies operating outside government control entirely, something we haven't yet imagined? The evolution continues. The only certainty is that money will keep changing, as it always has, shaped by technology, by politics, by the endless human dance of trust and suspicion. 100 years from now, people might look at our paper bills the way we look at cowrie shells, quaint relics of a primitive, monetary past. Here's what I want to leave you with. Tomorrow, you'll buy something, maybe coffee, maybe groceries, maybe something online. You'll hand over paper, or swipe a card, or tap your phone. The transaction will take seconds. You won't think twice about it. But pause, just for a moment, to consider what's actually happening. You're participating in a mass collective belief system, one that spans continents and centuries, one that billions of people uphold every day, mostly without thinking about it. You're trusting that a stranger will accept your paper, that the numbers in your bank account mean something, that tomorrow the system will still work, and the miracle is, it does, day after day, transaction after transaction. The shared illusion holds. Money isn't real in any physical sense. It never was. Not paper, not coins, not gold. It's always been an agreement, a story, a collective act of imagination made manifest. And yet, it's one of the most powerful forces shaping human civilization. Wars are fought over it. Lives are dedicated to accumulating it. Societies rise and fall based on how well they manage it. All because we agree it matters. Next time you pull out a bill or tap your phone to pay, remember, you're not just buying something. You're participating in an ongoing human project thousands of years old, a project of trust, belief, and shared fiction that makes complex civilization possible. Money is humanity's collective dream, and like all dreams, it's both more fragile and more powerful than it appears. So that's the story of paper money. From Chinese innovation to European banking to American experimentation to digital transformation. A shared illusion that shapes our world. An invention that required centuries of trial and error, of disasters and recoveries, of lessons learned and forgotten and learned again. The next time you hold a bill in your hand, know that you're holding history. You're holding trust, made tangible. You're holding one of humanity's strangest and most successful ideas. Now, let's journey to another fascinating moment in history. We've explored how humanity transformed worthless paper into the foundation of modern economics, a journey of trust, failure, and reinvention spanning 1,000 years. But paper money wasn't the end of the story. It was just another beginning. Now let's explore a different kind of transformation, one that changed not just how we pay, but how we think about spending itself. From a simple cardboard card at a New York restaurant to the plastic rectangles that now outnumber people on Earth. We're about to discover when credit cards became popular and how they quietly rewired our relationship with money.